Hello again, class. We're now changing gears and moving into science fiction. So the first question we need to ask is, what is science fiction? What creates this genre and what are the things that define it? The first thing, in order to be a science fiction film or be science fiction of any media, you have to have something to do with science. If it doesn't have anything to do with science, it's really going to be a hard stretch to turn it into a science fiction work. But then we have to define what science is. And there are two main categories that we're going to be seeing in science fiction films that we'll be exploring. One is hard science, and this is the one that's probably the easiest to recognize because these are the hard surfaces, the shiny things, the things that people can hold, so the tangible objects. So technology, robots, spaceships, weapons. And then we also have soft science, which is just as valid and just as important to science fiction films, but it's a very different area. So this is where we have biology, sociology, and psychology. And whenever we're dealing with aliens or space monsters, and whenever we're working with science fiction and horror, these things become really important. So both of these two areas we'll be covering in this part of the class, and we'll be discussing both of them at length. So where does science come from? Its origins are in the 18th century. What we refer to as the Age of Reason, which is when people started kind of breaking the shackles of religion and realizing that there was a little bit more out there. So we have the theories of Galileo and Copernicus. We realized that the universe didn't revolve around the Earth was just merely a small part of all that. We also have the Industrial Revolution, which was in the 19th century, and this was really the birth of machines. So that's where we start getting factories, we start getting steam power, we start getting trains, and then ultimately cars, airplanes, and things like that. So with these two things put together, we start thinking about science, and science fiction comes out of this. Also, science fiction films are going to ask one important question: are knowledge and technology at odds with God and nature? This is a very important question that gets asked in these films, and they're always going to be, they might be asking it differently, but there's always going to be some version of this question being posed. So if a film has all of these things, it can be qualified as science fiction, in my opinion. Some other films might skirt around some of these things, so it's kind of debatable. So the origins of science fiction, where does it come from? We're going to go way back, probably to probably the first work, debatably, of science fiction, and that's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We already talked about this in the horror part of the class, but it's both horror and science fiction because of the fact we have a mad scientist, so to speak, and this mad scientist ends up creating something, and we have that question: is science at odds with God and nature? This is something that Dr. Frankenstein comes to grips with throughout Frankenstein and then Bride of Frankenstein, but the novel kind of includes both of those. And then around 1860, a little bit later, we have Jules Verne, probably one of the first industrial revolution and first sci-fi genres. So 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, about the Nautilus, the high-tech submarine, at least high-tech for that time. First Men on the Moon, Master of the World. So Jules Verne considered our first real genreist in science fiction. And then at the turn of the century, we have H.G. Wells, who is the next major sci-fi writer. So The Time Machine, Island of Dr. Moreau, The Shape of Things to Come. Very, very important works of science fiction, which would end up shaping the works that come later. And then also, 1911, we have Hugo Gernsback's Ralph 124C41 plus A Romance of the Year 2660. And this is important. This was a short story, and it was published in a magazine or book collection called Amazing Stories. And this was the first science-fiction, which is what they called it then, before science fiction was coined as a phrase, the first science-fiction magazine. And throughout the 20th century, the most important sci-fi works and the ones that were adapted into films were going to be coming from these science fiction magazines and pulp anthologies. So these short stories would be really, really important for later science fiction. Now when we move into cinematic works, we have from 1902 George Méliès, A Trip to the Moon. And this is a very early, very crude, primitive silent work, but it's about people that fly into space. And This was, considered the first science fiction work of cinema, and it borrowed from both Verne and H.G. Wells to create this. And a little background on Méliès: he was a filmmaker, but he liked doing tricks. He was also a magician, so he really liked sleight of hand and applied that in a cinematic fashion. And what is science fiction but special effects and sleight of hand happy? So he attempted to borrow or buy a camera, but they didn't really exist at that point. So he took a projector and turned it into a camera, and then started building his own sets and everything else. So a lot of the special effects that would be used heavily in science fiction and in other films later on were really pioneered by Méliès at the around 1902 through about 1910. So very, very important to the beginning of that. So multiple exposure, important for spaceships flying around, split screen, stop motion, miniatures, mechanical backgrounds, a lot of things that would continue to be used in various forms, up into the early 1990s. And then 1925, we have Fritz Lang's Metropolis. This is a work of German Expressionism. We talked about that back with horror as well. So Fritz Lang was tied into that whole particular movement. And Metropolis is seen as one of our first high-tech city movies. I guess you could kind of call it a dystopia, which is a topic we'll get into a little bit later. And we have a futuristic city split into two classes: the rulers and the worker drones. And then a magician ends up creating or a wizard ends up creating a robot. Someone falls in love with her, and then the two classes come into conflict. So similar themes that end up coming up: man versus technology, things like that we would end up seeing in a lot of later works. So two early cinematic works there. And then we have in 1936 Things to Come, which was H.G. Wells' script of his novel The Shape of Things to Come, which is one of his popular sci-fi novels. But what's interesting about this particular film is that we don't have a lot of science fiction prior to World War II. Most of it really comes afterwards. And there's a very different idea of what the world will be like films made pre-war. So this was made in 1936, and so it imagines World War II, because in 1936 they could kind of see it happening. But in this particular film, the World War begins in 1940 and lasts until 1970. Pretty much destroys civilization, and people go back to pretty much Stone Age activity. And then the people that kind of survived the war and kept technology alive took over and then turned civilization into a utopia that was based on technology. So this is very different from the later sci-fi, because the attitude towards humanity and technology is very different. The thought was that humanity was essentially savage, but technology could be used to tame that inner savage, and technology would be what would transform humanity. Unfortunately, as we find out in World War II, technology is much better at killing people than it is in saving people and transforming them into, utopian gods. It's actually much better at destroying entire cities. So that is one reason why the sci-fi that we know and love has a much different attitude from films like Things to Come. So the atomic age, this is post-World War II. Obviously ushered in by the point where we started using atomic bombs. So it's after World War II that the science fiction film boom begins. This is when science fiction really became popular, because this is the sort of thing that was on people's minds. So we have technological advancement. This is something that was on people's minds. Weaponry, rockets, space travel is now a possibility. So if you can create a missile or a rocket that you can shoot halfway across the world and blow up another city, you could probably take the same rocket and shoot it straight up into the sky, into space. So that becomes an after product of our desire to destroy each other. Also, there's the Cold War, so there's a constant threat of atomic destruction by the U.S. and the Soviets. There's also anti-communist paranoia. So we see both of these thoughts filtering into these post-World War II science fiction films. Also, flying saucers. From 1947, or right around the end of World War II, a lot of flying saucer sightings kind of captured the public's imagination, and so obviously there are going to be a lot of flying saucer films because of that, because it was on people's minds, and the studios wanted to capitalize on that. So who knows whether they were flying wings, or if they were experimental aircraft, or if they were actually aliens, but this was something that was out there. So some of the common sci-fi themes we end up seeing, which are all filtered from these, I think, these ideas here, the atomic bomb and its side effects. We end up with things like Godzilla, monsters created by that, alien invasion and infiltration of society by aliens. So this is that threat of the communists. They're infiltrating society and destroying our capitalistic way of life, but instead they're replaced by aliens and things like that. Also, world destruction, aliens coming down and destroying us. So if we can destroy ourselves, then aliens could do it as well. So movies like The Thing, or The Thing from Another World, which is its full title, War of the Worlds, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Them, which is about giant ants, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which is another like a iguana turned into a monster, very much like a Godzilla. So popular themes and popular films from this era. So the film for this particular lesson is The Day the Earth Stood Still from 1951. It was directed by Robert Wise, who also directed The Haunting, which I've occasionally used as a psychological horror or ghost story in this class, and based on a science fiction short story called Farewell to the Master from 1940 by Harry Bates, probably published in a Hugo Gernsback science fiction rag. So the question we have in this film that's very important is what would happen if aliens landed on Earth, and how would the humans react to this? So there's a split second to decide whether the aliens are going to be nice or whether they're going to be evil, and how are we going to kind of get over that moment of tension. In most cases, we tend to see that the aliens are violent. So in films like Invaders from Mars, Independence Day, War of the Worlds, the aliens show up, and even if we expect them to be nice, they destroy everything. In this particular case, we have a different situation where the aliens might actually be kind of nice, but we're a little bit too trigger happy. So the idea explored in this film was that humans have trouble subverting warlike tendencies. Like in the film Things to Come. And paranoia is a stronger force than wisdom. So our characters in this film are definitely kind of fighting paranoia. They might have some things to say, but unfortunately, it's really hard for them to actually get this through.